In the glittering courts of 18th century Europe, where fashion was grandeur and status sat atop one's head, powdered wigs reigned supreme. Towering, perfumed, and impossibly elaborate, these Baroque creations were symbols of elegance until you got close. Beneath the curls and flourishes, lice thrived in colonies, feasting and multiplying in the warmth of human scalps. The elite scratched discreetly with ivory sticks, dusted their wigs with scented powders to mask the stench, and endured the crawling discomfort in silence. These weren't just accessories, they were ecosystems. But how did such a grotesque trend become the height of refinement? And what does it reveal about vanity, suffering, and the strange price of beauty in the age of enlightenment? The great powdered wigs of the 18th century did not appear suddenly, as if conjured by some Parisian magician with a comb and puff of powder. Their story began decades earlier, in the corridors of power and vanity, where politics, plague, and the cult of appearance intertwined. To understand the elaborate coiffures that would one day teeter atop heads like sculpted monuments, one must first step back into the 17th century and witness the moment when fashion became armor and hair became a battlefield. It was the court of Louis XIII of France that first set the stage. In the early 1620s, the young king began to lose his hair, a cruel trick of fate for a monarch whose authority was intertwined with the divine imagery of kingship. Baldness, in an age obsessed with symmetry and proportion, threatened more than vanity. It risked projecting weakness. Louis, in a decision that would ripple through European society for generations, turned to a solution both practical and symbolic: a voluminous wig of human hair. It concealed the truth and, more importantly, declared that even nature could be corrected by artifice. His courtiers, unwilling to appear less fashionable than their sovereign, soon followed suit, and the wig became a visible marker of loyalty and taste. By the time Louis XIV, the Sun King, ascended the throne, the wig was no longer merely a disguise but a weapon of spectacle. Louis XIV elevated wig-wearing into an art form, using its towering proportions and curling cascades to enhance his already commanding presence. At court, hair became architecture, rising in elaborate arrangements that reflected the grandeur of Versailles itself. Wigmakers, once humble tradesmen, became artists in their own right, commanding high prices for creations that could take hours to perfect each morning. They used human hair, horsehair, and even yak hair imported from distant lands, all stitched into frames that transformed heads into living sculptures. This growing fashion was not merely aesthetic, it was political. The wig was an emblem of stability and authority at a time when Europe was fracturing under religious wars and shifting alliances. A towering coiffure suggested wealth, control, and the leisure to maintain such a burden. Those without wigs risked appearing provincial or rebellious. Those with them could signal their place in the hierarchy without speaking a word. The style spread outward from France, infiltrating the courts of England, Spain, and the German states. Yet as wigs grew larger and more elaborate, they also grew heavier, hotter, and more expensive. Maintaining one was a daily ritual involving oils, powders, and meticulous combing. In an age when bathing was infrequent and indoor plumbing rare, cleanliness was an elusive ideal. Hairpieces were rarely washed in the modern sense. Instead, they were refreshed with scented powders and pomades that disguised the odors of sweat, smoke, and the streets. For the wealthy, this maintenance was handled by professional hairdressers or valets. For the less fortunate, it was a solitary, laborious process, often skipped entirely for weeks at a time. It was here, in this fertile meeting ground of warmth, moisture, and organic material, that the first whispers of infestation began. Early wigs, though less enormous than their 18th century descendants, were already perfect havens for lice and other small pests. The creatures found shelter in the dense curls and fed at the scalp beneath, thriving in the absence of regular cleaning. Those afflicted might scratch discreetly during a conversation or step away to the privacy of a corridor to use a long-handled comb. Powdering helped, for a time, to repel or kill some of the invaders, but the war was one of attrition. Remove them today, and they return tomorrow. By the late 17th century, the wig had crossed the Channel to England, where Charles II, restored to the throne after years in exile, brought with him the French court's love of fashion and extravagance. English nobility embraced the wig with fervor, and soon even lawyers, judges, and merchants adopted it as part of their professional dress. In this new environment, the wig's meaning shifted slightly. In France, it was an emblem of royal glamour. In England, it became a badge of institutional authority. A barrister's curled white peruke might not match the soaring height of a courtier's coiffure, but it carried equal symbolic weight. The expansion of the wig trade created an entire economy of artisans, from wig makers and hair merchants to powder sellers and decorative accessory suppliers. Hair was sourced from across Europe, with some of the finest coming from Italian peasants who sold their locks to traveling merchants. Horsehair, coarser but more durable, was favored for creating volume and structure. The manufacturing process was painstaking, involving hours of weaving, knotting, and stitching. Completed wigs were stored on wooden stands, covered with cloths to protect them from dust, and, increasingly, from the insects that seemed drawn to the warm, scented interiors. The cultural tide that carried wigs to their Baroque peak was a blend of artifice and necessity. The 30 Years' War had left Europe scarred, but in the decades that followed, an appetite for display surged. Portraits of the era reveal men and women framed by great halos of curls, their faces powdered pale to contrast with the dark, cascading locks. Wigs became stages for decoration. Ribbons, feathers, jeweled pins, and flowers were woven into the hair, turning the head into a kind of living tableau. In some cases, miniature ships or pastoral scenes were built into the coiffure, requiring extraordinary skill to balance. This was the seedbed from which the 18th century's most excessive wigs would grow. As the Enlightenment dawned, reason and philosophy began to reshape Europe's intellectual landscape, but in matters of fashion, spectacle still reigned supreme. The powdered wig became both mask and mirror, concealing the imperfections of the human form while reflecting the ambitions and vanities of its wearer. Yet, as in all such histories, the same grandeur that inspired also contained the seeds of its undoing. In the coming decades, wigs would grow to unprecedented sizes, their architecture requiring ever more hair, wire, and padding. They would demand more powder, more perfume, more maintenance, and with each added layer, they would become even more inviting to the parasites that had quietly shared the journey from the very beginning. The 18th century would not only be the golden age of the wig, but also the era in which the battle between beauty and biology reached its most absurd heights. The powdered towers that graced the ballrooms of Paris and London would be remembered for their elegance and ingenuity. But behind the silken ribbons and the floral perfumes, there was always the faint, persistent whisper of something else, a reminder that even the most exquisite creations of human vanity are never entirely free from the touch of nature. By the early decades of the 18th century, the wig was no longer a fashionable accessory. It had become a cultural institution. The modest perukes of the previous century had swollen into architectural wonders, the curls rising higher and sweeping wider with each passing season. These towering constructions, sometimes more than 2 feet in height, were the crowning glory of Europe's elites, the most visible expression of their wealth, refinement, and power. They were also, quietly, an invitation for trouble of the most intimate kind. In Paris, the fashion epicenter of the continent, the streets bustled with carriages bearing their powdered passengers to salons and theaters. When these passengers descended, they seemed to carry with them their own miniature stages, their wigs gleaming under candlelight, powdered to a pale perfection, adorned with silk ribbons or jeweled combs. The hair itself was often a carefully balanced blend of materials. Fine human hair for softness, horsehair for volume, and in some extreme cases, padded supports of wire and fabric to give the shape its bold silhouette. The application of powder, wheat flour, starch, or ground orris root was the final stroke, creating the uniform ivory hue that turned each head into a sculpted masterpiece. This aesthetic ambition came at a cost. The more complex the structure, the more difficult it was to clean. Unlike natural hair, which could be washed and combed with relative ease, a monumental wig was an intricate web of fibers stitched into a base and set with pomades. It could not simply be dunked in water without risking ruin. Cleaning meant carefully removing powder, combing out tangles, and reapplying scented oils, a process that took hours and, more often than not, was postponed in favor of a quick dusting and a fresh layer of fragrance. The result was inevitable. Beneath the lavender-scented exterior, warmth and organic matter created an ideal microclimate for lice. The parasites themselves were both opportunistic and democratic. They did not discriminate between noble and merchant, duchess and lawyer. Once introduced into a wig, they could thrive undetected for days or even weeks, concealed in the deep curls and feeding at the scalp. Their presence was not just an irritant, it was a social embarrassment. To be caught scratching in public risked shattering the illusion of poise, and so ingenious solutions arose. Among the more discreet was the scratcher, a long, thin stick of ivory, silver, or whalebone, often decorated, that could be slipped under the wig to reach an itch without disturbing the style. Some were hollow, fitted with tiny compartments for scented pomade, allowing a dab to be applied directly to the offending spot. The war against the infestation was fought with powders of a different sort. Mixtures of crushed herbs, tobacco, or mercury compounds were sprinkled into the hair in hopes of killing the invaders. Wigmakers' back rooms became small laboratories, where apprentices experimented with concoctions that promised both pest control and freshness. Yet such remedies were never permanent. Lice were persistent, and every ball, theater, or gathering provided new opportunities for them to spread. At the same time, wig design was reaching its most theatrical extremes. The so-called fontange style for women involved hair arranged in tiers, supported by wire frames, and often topped with lace or ribbon structures that soared above the head like cathedral spires. Men's wigs, though less vertical, spread wide in thick waves and curls, creating a broad, square silhouette that magnified the wearer's shoulders and chest. In both cases, the head became a stage for spectacle, and the more elaborate the construction, the more it announced the wearer's place in society. The economics of the wig trade expanded accordingly. Wigmakers, or perruquiers in France, employed teams of hair sorters, curlers, and stitchers, each specializing in a particular task. Hair was shipped in from rural communities, purchased from peasants for modest sums, and transformed in the city into luxury goods worth many times their original cost. The workshops smelled of pomade, a rich blend of lard or bear grease mixed with perfumes like bergamot or orange blossom, and of powder, whose fine dust clung to the workers' clothes and lungs. In such conditions, infestation was as much an occupational hazard as it was a fashion nuisance. London, too, became a major center of wig culture. There, the styles were slightly more restrained than in Paris, but still grand by any reasonable measure. The British preference for legal and institutional wigs, especially among judges and barristers, lent the style an air of permanence. A courtroom in full session was a parade of powdered domes, the curls falling with mathematical precision, their whiteness suggesting both age and dignity. Yet the wigs worn in court were often older, reused for years, and therefore prime territory for lice colonies. Judges were known to keep their wigs covered when not in use, but not all covers could keep the pests out. The growing size of wigs created a peculiar paradox. They were designed to project control, refinement, and mastery over nature. Yet they became increasingly vulnerable to the most uncontrollable of natural forces, living creatures that could not be entirely banished. The more elaborate the coiffure, the more it invited both admiration and infestation. And because wigs were often shared among members of a household or rented for special occasions, the same ornate masterpiece might crown the heads of several wearers in quick succession, each unwittingly contributing to its hidden ecosystem. Scented powders remained the first line of defense against the sensory evidence of infestation. Orris root gave a violet-like fragrance. Powdered lavender and rose petals added floral notes. Bergamot lent a citrus sharpness. These scents did double duty. They masked any unpleasant odor and signaled refinement to those nearby. But they also mingled with the faint, musty smell of hair that had been kept too long without airing, a combination as much a signature of the age as the wigs themselves. The paradox of the powdered monuments was that they existed in an era of enlightenment. when reason and science were reshaping the European mind. Philosophers debated the nature of liberty, astronomers charted the heavens, and naturalists cataloged the species of the earth. Yet all the while, some of the brightest minds of the age attended lectures with small creatures feeding in the curls above their ears. The wig, in this way, was both a triumph and a quiet defeat, a monument to human creativity undermined by the persistence of life's smallest forms. By mid-century, the wig's silhouette had reached proportions that demanded daily maintenance, dedicated storage, and professional care. For the wealthy, this meant a valet or maid who specialized in hair and wigs, someone skilled in arranging, powdering, and, discreetly, checking for signs of infestation. For those without such resources, the burden was heavier. Some attempted to sleep in their wigs, to preserve the day's arrangement, only to find the warmth and immobility an irresistible invitation for lice. Others kept multiple wigs in rotation, alternating them to allow for cleaning. Though cleaning, in this context, often meant little more than a brisk beating to dislodge dust and a new layer of powder to hide the rest. The powdered monuments were more than fashion. They were statements, tools, and performances. They framed the face like a stage curtain, casting the wearer in a role that might be regal, seductive, or authoritative. They turned every entrance into an unveiling, every bow into a tableau. Yet they also carried an unspoken truth, shared in quiet glances and private scratching sessions, that no matter how grand the construction, no matter how carefully perfumed, there was always the possibility of an uninvited guest making its way through the curls. It was this tension between grandeur and discomfort, between public splendor and private annoyance, that would define the 18th century's relationship with the wig. And as the century progressed, that tension would only sharpen, for the styles would grow ever higher and more intricate, and the battle with the unseen enemy would become both more creative and more desperate. Beneath the soft fall of curls and the fragrant cloud of powder, an entire ecosystem stirred, invisible to the eyes of polite society, yet as complex in its own way as the salons and courts above. The 18th century wig was not merely an ornament of human vanity. It was, for lice and their kin, a warm, shaded, and abundant homeland. These creatures were opportunists of the highest order, thriving wherever warmth met sustenance. And in the heat of a crowded ballroom or the close quarters of a carriage, they prospered as fully as their human hosts celebrated their own magnificence. The structure of a wig provided an ideal terrain. Layers of hair, human, horse, or yak, were stitched and knotted into dense arrangements that formed natural tunnels and chambers. The scalp beneath offered both warmth and a ready source of nourishment. Between these two layers, the living and the artificial, was a sheltered zone, a no-man's land inaccessible to comb or soap, where the lice could live undisturbed. A single wig could harbor hundreds of them, ranging from full-grown adults to tiny nymphs, each generation following the last in a silent cycle of feeding, breeding, and laying eggs. These eggs, or nits, were small, pearly ovals glued firmly to the hair shafts. They clung stubbornly through the daily rituals of powdering and pomading, invisible beneath the pale dust. Powder could smother some, particularly if laced with certain herbs or chemicals, but the survivors emerged as the next wave in an endless campaign. The lifespan of a louse was short, mere weeks, yet in that time it could lay dozens of eggs, ensuring that its lineage endured as long as the wig remained unwashed. Not all wig wearers were ignorant of their uninvited tenants. Many knew, though few would admit it aloud, that their wigs were compromised. Some even came to regard the presence of lice as inevitable, part of the cost of fashion, much like the weight of the hairpiece or the discomfort of its fit. The scratching stick, that discreet tool of relief, became a constant companion, hidden in a pocket or tucked into a belt, ready to be slipped under the curls at the first telltale tingle. The more refined users could perform the maneuver mid-conversation without so much as ruffling the powder. For wig makers, lice were an occupational hazard. Hair arrived from across Europe in bales and bundles, often straight from the heads of rural donors who lived in close quarters with animals and whose own hair was rarely free of pests. Before it could be worked into a wig, the hair had to be sorted, washed, and treated. Yet even the most diligent preparation could miss a few survivors. In the warm, bustling workshops where perruquiers and their assistants toiled, wigs in progress were stored side by side, making the spread of infestation almost inevitable. Some shops resorted to drastic measures, hanging wigs in closed cabinets filled with the smoke of burning herbs, or laying them out in freezing weather to kill the vermin. The results were mixed. The scented powders that graced so many heads served a double purpose: beauty and disguise. Orris root, lavender, rose petals, and bergamot masked the odors of sweat and pomade, but they also dulled the faint musky scent of lice. In theory, certain powders had insect-repellent qualities. Tobacco powder was a popular choice, but fashion often trumped function. A lady might choose a floral fragrance that complemented her gown, even if it offered little defense against the crawlers. The irony was sharp. In choosing elegance over efficacy, she unwittingly ensured the survival of her hidden guests. For the lice themselves, life in a wig was one of unparalleled opportunity. Here was warmth without the danger of weather, food without the need to hunt, and shelter in a labyrinth of hair impossible for predators to penetrate. Their only real threats were the occasional chemical assault, the rough shake of a wig being aired, or the rare full cleaning that dislodged them entirely. Yet in an age when wigs were often worn daily for weeks without such treatment, these dangers were infrequent. The human hosts, meanwhile, developed a quiet vocabulary for discussing the problem without naming it. A friend might remark that someone's powder seems freshly applied, a polite way of suggesting that perhaps the scent was being used to cover something else. Servants tasked with maintaining their employers' wigs became the first line of defense, checking for signs of infestation and applying powders or oils as needed. In some households, wigs were stored in special boxes lined with cedar or lavender in hopes of deterring pests, though the success of these measures varied. In the courts and salons where appearance was paramount, the very idea of infestation was a kind of social heresy. Here, the wig was a mask not only for baldness or thinning hair, but for the imperfections of life itself. It projected control, refinement, and immunity from the mundane troubles of the lower classes. That parasites could breach this illusion was an uncomfortable truth best ignored. And so the hidden kingdoms flourished, sustained by silence as much as by powder and pomade. The relationship between human and parasite in this setting was strangely symbiotic. The lice depended on the humans for warmth and sustenance, while the humans, unwilling to dismantle their elaborate coiffures, tolerated the discomfort in exchange for the social power the wig conferred. The scratching stick, the fragrant powder, the occasional application of herbal remedies. These were not acts of eradication so much as gestures of truce, small concessions to maintain the balance between fashion and reality. Occasionally, however, the balance tipped. A particularly severe infestation could cause visible irritation, reddened skin along the hairline, scabs where scratching had broken the surface, or even small sores beneath the wig. In such cases, the afflicted might be forced to retreat from society for a time, claiming illness or the need for travel, while the wig underwent more aggressive treatment. Wigmakers knew the signs and handled such situations discreetly, for the reputation of a fashionable client was as delicate as the curls they wore. In this way, the hidden kingdoms beneath the powder were both an open secret and an invisible world. To study them is to be reminded that human history is not only the story of kings, queens, and great events, but of the small, persistent lives that have accompanied us at every turn. The 18th century wig, for all its grandeur, was no exception. It was a stage where beauty and biology performed side by side, one in the spotlight, the other in the shadows, each shaping the other in ways few cared to acknowledge. As the century progressed, the wigs would grow even more elaborate, the powders more heavily scented, and the stakes of appearance higher than ever. And with each step upward in grandeur, the hidden kingdoms would expand as well, adapting, enduring, and quietly writing their own chapter in the story of human vanity. The 18th century wig was both crown and burden, and those who wore it lived in a constant state of negotiation between the demands of fashion and the realities of comfort. With infestation a persistent possibility, if not an outright certainty, the art of survival required a quiet arsenal of tools, powders, and techniques. These measures, some ingenious and others purely cosmetic, allowed wig wearers to maintain their composure while addressing, or at least concealing, the slow crawl of their hidden adversaries. Foremost among these instruments was the scratching stick, an object so intimately tied to wig culture that it deserves recognition as a small marvel of functional design. Known in France as a grappe perruque and in England simply as a scratcher, it was often carved from ivory, silver, whalebone, or fine wood. Measuring between 8 and 12 inches, the stick was slender enough to pass discreetly beneath the curls, yet sturdy enough to reach the scalp without bending. The business end was usually forked or tipped with a small, rounded paddle, designed to give relief without disturbing the wig's architecture. Skilled users could maneuver the stick with such precision that an itch was addressed in seconds, all while maintaining an unbroken conversation or a graceful bow. Some scratching sticks doubled as small perfume applicators. A hollow handle might hold a reserve of scented pomade, released in a controlled dab when the tip was pressed to the scalp. In this way, a lady at the opera could both ease her discomfort and freshen the fragrance of her coiffure without attracting notice. The act became so refined that in certain circles it bordered on performance, a silent ritual of elegance even in the midst of personal irritation. Powders were another essential defense. Applied daily or before social engagements, they served as both ornament and weapon. The base powder, usually made from starch or ground wheat flour, created the fashionable pale hue. Into this base, wig owners could mix their preferred scent or treatment. Orris root lent a sweet, violet-like fragrance. Lavender and rosemary were believed to deter pests. Tobacco powder, though pungent, was praised for its insecticidal qualities. Those with means might order custom blends from their wig maker, tailored to their needs and tastes. Yet not all powders were pleasant. Some of the most effective in combating lice contained substances we would now recognize as dangerous: mercury compounds, arsenic, and lead salts. These were used sparingly, for the risks were known even then, but desperation sometimes outweighed caution. A wig infested beyond comfort could ruin appearances at court or in business, and so a careful dusting of such lethal powder might be employed, with the hope that it would harm the vermin more than the wearer. The fine dust of these treatments hung in the air during application, coating not only the wig but the skin, clothing, and lungs of those nearby. Beyond personal tools and powders, the storage and maintenance of wigs played a crucial role in survival. Wealthy households maintained wig stands in dressing rooms, each fitted with a linen or silk cover to protect the hairpiece from dust and, theoretically, from pests. Some covers were lined with cedar shavings, crushed herbs, or dried citrus peels to repel insects. Others used boxes with tight-fitting lids, into which a wig could be placed alongside sachets of aromatic materials. Wig makers often recommended rotating wigs, allowing each one to rest for a few days between wearings, during which it might be aired in sunlight or subjected to more aggressive treatment. Sunlight was one of the simplest and most effective deterrents, for the heat and dryness could weaken or kill lice. On fine days, it was not uncommon to see wigs arranged on stands near open windows or in courtyards, their curls gleaming in the sun. This airing served another purpose as well. It revived the powder and perfume, keeping the wig fresh for its next outing. However, too much sun risked fading the color or damaging the delicate structure, so the practice required a careful balance. For the traveling elite, wig cases were indispensable. Crafted from leather or wood, these cases protected wigs from crushing and contamination on the road. A well-made case might also be fitted with compartments for scratching sticks, small powder boxes, and a comb or brush for last-minute adjustments. Servants responsible for such items became experts in their care, knowing when to air, when to powder, and when to seek the services of a professional wig maker to address more serious problems. In the wig maker's shops, more drastic measures could be taken. A heavily infested wig might be dismantled entirely, the hair boiled or smoked over pungent herbs such as wormwood or rue, then re-woven into a fresh frame. Some shops kept special fumigation cabinets, large wooden boxes into which wigs were placed before being filled with the smoke of burning rosemary, tobacco, or sulfur. The fumes could suffocate the pests, though they also left the wig reeking until it could be thoroughly aired. There was also a social strategy to survival, vigilance in the company one kept. Attending a ball or salon meant exposure not only to conversation and gossip, but to the possibility of acquiring unwanted guests from another's coiffure. Those who valued their wigs learned to avoid standing too close in crowded rooms, to decline the offer of a borrowed wig for a masquerade, and to limit the sharing of hair accessories. While such precautions could not eliminate risk, they demonstrated an awareness of the problem without acknowledging it outright. It is worth noting that not all defenses were purely practical. Some were symbolic gestures meant to reassure the wearer, much like a lucky charm. A ribbon tied at a certain angle, a sprig of dried lavender tucked beneath the curls, or a scratcher carved with a family crest. These items offered a sense of control in a situation that was, in truth, only partially within human power. The lice might return no matter the precautions, but the ritual of care created the illusion of mastery, and that illusion was often as valuable as the reality. The tools of survival, then, were as much about maintaining dignity as they were about physical relief. The scratching stick allowed for discretion. The powder masked both odor and discomfort. The storage practices promised safety between wearings. Together, they formed a quiet defense network against an enemy no one dared name in public. In their own way, these measures mirrored the wigs themselves, outwardly graceful, inwardly complex, and constantly balancing between display and necessity. As the century moved toward its middle decades, these tools would be tested as never before. Wigs would grow to unprecedented sizes, powders would become more elaborate, and infestations would prove ever more resilient. The battle for comfort beneath the powdered surface would intensify, and the ingenuity of both wig-makers and wearers would be pushed to its limits. For in the gilded theaters and candlelit drawing rooms of Europe, to falter in this struggle was to risk not only one's comfort, but one's place in the intricate dance of status, style, and survival. In the 18th century, scent was not a luxury, it was a necessity. The great powdered wigs that crowned Europe's elite were rarely, if ever, washed in a way we would recognize today. Instead, they were bathed in a cloud of finely milled powder and perfume, a fragrant armor that both enhanced beauty and concealed the less pleasant truths beneath. This ritual of scenting was as essential to the wig's survival as the stitching that held it together. Without it, the powdered monuments of the age would have been far less enchanting and far more revealing. The scented mask began with the powder itself. The base was typically starch or wheat flour, sifted to a texture as soft as silk. Into this were mixed fragrances, sometimes single note, sometimes complex blends, chosen to harmonize with the wearer's tastes or the season's fashion. Orris root, derived from the rhizomes of iris plants, lent a sweet, violet-like perfume that lingered for days. Lavender, both fresh and dried, brought a clean, herbal sharpness. Rose petals, crushed to dust, gave a soft floral note. Bergamot, imported from the Mediterranean, added a citrus brightness. These scents drifted in the air when a wig was powdered, filling the room with an aura that could cling to furniture for hours. Application was a performance in itself. A valet or hairdresser would place the wig on its stand or directly on the client's head, then dip a large puff, often made of swan's down, into the scented powder. With practiced movements, they would press and pat the puff over the curls, ensuring an even coating while avoiding clumps. The process produced a fine haze that settled not only on the hair, but on clothing, skin, and even the floor. In some households, a special powder room was dedicated to this task, its walls lined with washable fabric or glazed panels to catch the drifting dust. While powdering was, on the surface, about achieving the fashionable pale hue, its secondary purpose was concealment. The powder absorbed oils from the scalp and pomade from the wig, reducing shine and masking odors. More importantly, the fragrance helped disguise any unpleasant smells that might arise from long unwashed hair, sweat, or, in less fortunate cases, the faint, sour tang of lice infestation. In this way, the scented mask was both aesthetic and strategic, a barrier against suspicion as much as against scent. Perfume was layered over the powder, creating a complex olfactory signature. The French court favored blends that were opulent and long-lasting: ambergris for warmth, musk for depth, orange blossom for freshness. In England, subtler scents often prevailed, with herbal and citrus notes preferred for their perceived cleanliness. Some perfumes were dabbed directly onto the wig. Others were applied to handkerchiefs, gloves, or clothing, allowing the wearer to refresh the scent with a discreet gesture. A flick of the wrist could bring a perfumed glove to the nose, masking any unwanted intrusion from the outside air or from the wig itself. This layering of fragrance was not without its hazards. The same oils and extracts that gave perfume its potency could stain or degrade the wig's materials over time. Some scents, especially those derived from animal sources like musk or civet, could clash with the herbal powders beneath, producing a less than pleasant effect if not carefully balanced. Experienced wig dressers knew how to marry the two elements, ensuring that the fragrance projected refinement rather than confusion. For all its elegance, the scented mask was also a kind of silent confession. Those who relied heavily on fragrance to maintain the illusion of freshness often did so because the truth beneath could not be entirely banished. A wig worn daily, through the heat of summer or the crush of winter gatherings, would accumulate the traces of its journey: perspiration, city dust, candle smoke, and the slow work of time. Powder could disguise these for a while, but eventually the balance tipped, and even the most opulent scent could not entirely hide the reality. This tension between beauty and decay gave rise to a quiet hierarchy of fragrance. The most refined practitioners understood that less could be more. A subtle, well-chosen scent suggested that the wig beneath was already clean, that fragrance was an adornment rather than a necessity. Heavy, cloying perfume, on the other hand, risked signaling desperation, as if the wearer were attempting to drown the senses rather than please them. In the crowded rooms of court and salon, such nuances mattered. The scented mask was not confined to the upper classes. As wigs filtered down into the wardrobes of merchants, lawyers, and skilled artisans, so too did the practice of powdering and perfuming. In more modest households, the powder might be plain starch without costly additives, and the perfume a simple herbal infusion. Yet even here, the principle held. To scent the wig was to protect the self, to project an image of cleanliness and refinement that daily realities might not support. For wig makers, scent was a business in itself. Many kept their own recipes, passed down through generations or acquired from apothecaries. Some shops advertised their powders as both fashionable and medicinal, claiming they could prevent headaches, repel insects, or strengthen the hair. Whether or not these claims held truth, the association of fragrance with health gave the scented mask an additional layer of appeal. Clients could believe that they were not only beautifying themselves, but safeguarding their well-being. The act of powdering and scenting also had a ceremonial quality. Before an important engagement, a ball, a trial, an audience with a monarch, the process of preparing the wig was a moment of transformation. The wearer sat still, allowing the valet or hairdresser to work, the air gradually filling with the chosen fragrance. The mirror revealed not just a reflection but a persona, complete with the pale, perfumed crown that would face the public. Beneath the scent, beneath the powder, whatever discomfort or imperfection remained was locked away, hidden behind the mask. In this way, the scented mask was more than a practical solution to the wig's challenges. It was a metaphor for the age itself, an Enlightenment paradox in which reason and science advanced while artifice and display remained central to identity. The fragrance did not remove the problem, it reframed it, allowing the wearer to carry on as if no problem existed at all. It was both an indulgence and a defense, an act of beauty that doubled as an act of survival. As the 18th century progressed, the scented mask would grow ever more elaborate, with powders tinted in delicate pastels, perfumes imported from distant lands, and application techniques refined to an art. Yet the underlying truth remained unchanged. The fragrance was there not only to delight but to protect, to conceal, and to maintain the fragile illusion upon which the world of wigs was built. Behind the gleaming shop windows of Europe's most fashionable streets, wig makers waged a quiet, relentless war. To the public, their work was a triumph of artistry. Curling, powdering, and sculpting human and animal hair into the towering forms that crowned nobles, judges, and merchants. But in the workshops behind the display rooms, the fight was far less glamorous. Here, the enemies were not rival fashion houses, but heat, humidity, decay, and the most tenacious of all intruders, lice. The raw materials of their trade arrived from all over the continent. Bundles of hair came in from the French countryside, from the peasant markets of Italy, from the remote highlands of Scotland, and from further afield in the form of coarser yak hair from Asia. It was a commodity market in its own right, with quality and price varying by color, texture, and length. But with every shipment came the possibility of contamination. Hair cut from living heads was rarely clean by modern standards, and even the most pristine locks might hide nits clinging to their shafts. Wig makers learned early that to protect their stock was to protect their reputation. The first step in the battle was inspection. Journeymen and apprentices would sit at long benches under strong light, teasing out each bundle, searching for the telltale signs of infestation. Any hair found to be crawling was isolated, either destroyed or sent through one of the shop's decontamination processes. These ranged from the gentle, washing in vinegar or herbal infusions of rosemary, lavender, or wormwood, to the extreme, boiling, baking in ovens, or smoking over smoldering sulfur. The latter methods were risky. Too much heat could ruin the hair's texture, rendering it brittle and useless for fine work. But a wig maker could not afford to let pests survive. Once clean, the hair was sorted, combed, and curled. Curls were set with heated irons or wooden rollers coated in pomade, then left to dry in racks. The pomade itself, usually a blend of animal fat and fragrance, was both a styling aid and a deterrent to pests, at least in theory. Some wig makers added small amounts of powdered tobacco or camphor to the mixture, hoping to keep lice from taking hold. The scent of such preparations could be sharp, even acrid, but clients often accepted this as the price of a long-lasting style. The assembly of a wig was a painstaking process, often taking days or even weeks. Hair was knotted into lace foundations or sewn onto linen caps, with careful attention to density, direction, and layering. The finished wig might weigh several pounds, especially in the case of the grander court styles. Its structure, the lace, padding, and wire, created countless small spaces in which lice could later take refuge. Wig makers knew this, and so the war extended beyond the making of the wig to its aftercare. Professional maintenance was as much a part of the wig maker's business as sales. Clients returned regularly to have their wigs cleaned, repaired, or restyled. This cleaning could mean anything from a brisk brushing and powdering to a complete disassembly and delousing. In severe cases, the wig was fumigated in a sealed cabinet with the smoke of burning rosemary, juniper, or tobacco, or subjected to vapors from heated vinegar. More expensive wigs were treated with greater care, both to preserve their materials and because their owners demanded discretion. No one wished it known that their magnificent coiffure had harbored vermin. Discretion was, in fact, one of the wig maker's most valuable skills. Gossip could ruin a client's social standing, and so infestations were never discussed openly. Shop assistants were trained to handle such matters in whispers, using euphemisms like refreshing the foundations or renewing the understructure. Bills itemized these services in vague terms, ensuring that anyone reading them, a butler, a spouse, or a rival, would be none the wiser. But for all their vigilance, wig makers could never entirely win the war. The nature of the wig, worn close to the scalp, exposed to the environments of ballrooms, theaters, and crowded streets, made it a perpetual target. Each time a client wore their wig into a gathering, they risked bringing back more than compliments. And each time a wig returned to the shop for restyling, it could pass along its invisible passengers to the other pieces in the room if precautions were lax. To counter this, some of the best establishments instituted rigorous handling protocols. Wigs suspected of infestation were worked on only at certain benches by craftsmen wearing protective aprons. Tools used on them were cleaned separately, often in boiling water or alcohol. The stands on which wigs rested were wiped with vinegar or camphor oil. Even with these measures, outbreaks could happen, and when they did, the damage to a workshop's reputation could be swift and costly. The war was fought on another front as well: odor. The combination of human wear, animal fat pomade, and occasional fumigation meant that a neglected wig could develop an aroma that no amount of floral powder could disguise. Wigmakers learned to layer scents with as much care as they layered curls, balancing strong herbal deterrents with more pleasant notes. A blend of rosemary and bergamot might mask the smell of tobacco powder. Rose and ambergris could soften the edge of camphor. These perfumes were part of the artistry, and some clients were fiercely loyal to a particular shop simply because they favored its signature scent. The wigmaker's war was not only defensive. Innovation was a weapon, and the most successful craftsmen experimented constantly. New powders were tried, new pomade formulas tested, new storage methods devised. Some began producing travel cases lined with cedar or impregnated with aromatic oils. Others offered subscription services for regular cleaning and repowdering, ensuring that wigs spent less time in the conditions lice loved best. This constant battle forged a kind of unspoken alliance between wigmakers and their clients. Both understood that the powdered monument atop one's head was more than an ornament. It was a fragile construction, vulnerable to time, wear, and nature's smallest saboteurs. The wigmaker's task was to keep it beautiful and functional, to erase the signs of its hidden life so completely that the wearer could walk into any room as if their coiffure were untouched by the world beyond the mirror. And so, behind the grand facades and polished counters, the war went on, fought with smoke and scent, with boiling water and careful hands, with whispered codes and swift, silent efficiency. It was a war without victory, only continual skirmishes, but in that endless struggle lay the quiet genius of the 18th century wigmaker. They were not merely artisans, they were guardians of illusions, protectors of a fragile elegance that depended, more than anyone cared to admit, on their willingness to confront what others refused to see. By the middle of the 18th century, the powdered wig had transcended fashion. It was no longer merely a mark of refinement or wealth. It had become a visible language of authority. In courts of law, in parliamentary chambers, in diplomatic salons, and at royal audiences, the wig was a crown in all but name, a sign that the wearer was not merely a man or woman, but an institution. Its curls were the visual grammar of power, and those who sat beneath them understood the role they played in the theater of governance. In Britain, the connection between wigs and political authority was perhaps strongest in the legal profession. Judges and barristers alike wore wigs in the courtroom, their whiteness and symmetry projecting impartiality, tradition, and gravitas. The full-bottomed wig, with long cascading curls falling over the shoulders, was favored for ceremonial occasions and high-profile trials. Shorter, tighter styles, the tie wig or bob wig, served for daily proceedings. To don such a wig was to step into a role older than oneself, to become a vessel of the law rather than an individual with personal interests. Even in the face of infestation or discomfort, the dignity of the wig was maintained at all costs. Across the Channel, at the court of Versailles, wigs functioned less as a legal uniform and more as a political instrument. The Sun King, Louis XIV, had set the precedent for using hair as a tool of dominance, his towering peruke creating a physical presence that no rival could match. His successors, while less imposing, upheld the tradition. Ministers, courtiers, and diplomats all wore wigs suited to their station, grand and full for the highest ranks, more modest for those still climbing the ladder. The size, style, and ornamentation of a wig could communicate allegiance, ambition, and subtle political positioning without a single word being spoken. In diplomacy, the wig was a silent participant at every negotiation table. When envoys met in candlelit chambers to discuss treaties or trade agreements, the shimmer of powder and the arrangement of curls were as much part of the performance as the exchange of documents. A carefully chosen wig could signal respect for the host nation's customs, an embrace of formality, or even a calculated effort to appear more imposing. Conversely, to appear in an ill-kept or outdated style risked insult, whether intentional or not. The military sphere had its own relationship with wigs, though more restrained. Officers often wore simpler wigs or tied natural hair in queues, but on formal occasions, they adopted powdered coiffures that linked them visually to the ruling class they served. These wigs were shorter, more practical for movement, but still signified that the officer was part of the same social fabric as the statesmen and courtiers who commanded armies from afar. The power of wigs in politics was not merely visual, it was also psychological. The wearer, looking into a mirror before stepping into the chamber or court, felt the transformation. The wig created a boundary between the private self and the public role. Beneath it, a man might be uncertain, tired, even plagued by the discomfort of lice. But once the wig was settled and powdered, he became the embodiment of his office. It was a kind of armor, less for the body than for the mind. The public, too, responded to the symbol. Citizens might never hear a judge speak in private, but in court, the wig framed his words with the weight of tradition. Petitioners approaching a government minister saw not only the man but the pale, powdered curls that marked him as a figure of influence. Even dissenters, who mocked the excesses of aristocratic fashion, acknowledged that the wig carried an aura of authority. Yet beneath the grandeur, the same quiet war with nature continued. Politicians and judges were as vulnerable to infestation as any courtier or merchant. In the heated atmosphere of parliamentary sessions or the crowded galleries of a royal audience, the warmth beneath a wig could be stifling. Scratching sticks were as common in the pockets of statesmen as in those of the opera-going elite. Scented powders were chosen not only for elegance, but for their ability to mask the reality of long hours beneath heavy hair. In some cases, the wig even became a political liability. Opponents might whisper about the state of a rival's coiffure, hinting that its musty smell betrayed poor hygiene or careless servants. Satirists in London and Paris produced prints mocking politicians with absurdly large or disheveled wigs, using the image to undermine their credibility. A caricature could show curls crawling with exaggerated insects, the visual joke undercutting the dignity of an entire party or policy. For revolutionaries and reformers, the wig became a symbol of the old order, of hierarchy, privilege, and detachment from the realities of common life. In France, as revolutionary fervor rose toward the century's end, the elaborate wigs of the aristocracy became targets of scorn. To wear one in certain districts of Paris by the 1790s was to invite suspicion or worse. The same applied in parts of England during periods of political unrest, where radicals denounced wigs as relics of corruption. Still, in the mid-century height of their power, wigs were inseparable from the machinery of politics. To remove them would have been to strip away a layer of the state's performance, to reveal the ordinary humanity of those who claimed extraordinary authority. And so, the powdered thrones remained in place, in courts, in chambers, in council rooms, even as the world beyond their walls began to shift. In this way, the political life of the wig mirrored the private life beneath it. Both were elaborate constructions maintained through constant effort. Both projected control while concealing fragility, and both depended on the unspoken agreement of those who participated in the illusion. As long as the illusion held, the curls could command a room, silence a crowd, or ratify a treaty. But when the illusion began to crumble, whether through political upheaval or the quiet persistence of nature's smallest insurgents, the authority of the powdered throne was not as invincible as it seemed. The ballroom was the true crucible of 18th century fashion, a furnace of light, heat, and human proximity in which the powdered wig was tested to its limits. Here, in the swirl of silk skirts and brocade coats, in the thrum of violins and the pulse of the minuet, wigs did more than crown their wearers. They proclaimed their status, seduced the eye, and joined the silent competition for notice and admiration. But beneath the chandeliers, as fans fluttered and gloved hands clasped in formal dances, another competition unfolded, one invisible, unspoken, and far less romantic. The preparation for such a night began hours before the first guests arrived. In private dressing rooms, valets and hairdressers worked with military precision, ensuring every curl sat perfectly, every ribbon and jewel was balanced, every puff of powder evenly distributed. Pomades scented with bergamot or lavender coated the hair, fixing curls in place while adding a sheen to catch the candlelight. Powder, fine as frost, settled into the layers of the wig, giving it the coveted pale glow. For the wearer, the wig was not merely part of the costume. It was the frame through which the entire evening would be experienced. Stepping into the ballroom was to step into a blaze. Hundreds of candles threw reflections across mirrors and polished floors. The air shimmered with perfume, warmed by the press of bodies and the constant movement of the dance. Curls bobbed and swayed in time with the music, catching light as they turned. For a moment, the wig was everything it promised to be, a crown of beauty and authority, as much a part of the dance as the steps themselves. But the same conditions that heightened its splendor also created a perfect environment for its oldest enemies. Heat rose from the crowd, trapped beneath layers of hair and fabric. Sweat dampened the scalp, activating the faint scent of pomade beneath the powder. If a wig harbored lice, the warmth and closeness of the ballroom were their signal to thrive. A single brush of curls in a crowded set, a shared bow in the intricate figures of a dance, could be enough for an unseen passenger to change hosts. For the afflicted, the challenge was to remain composed. A sudden itch could be addressed only with the most discreet use of a scratching stick, slid under the curls with a practiced motion during a turn or pause in the music. To break the illusion by scratching openly would have been unthinkable. The art lay in timing, a subtle relief between dances, a moment taken in the shadow of a doorway or behind a fluttering fan. The scent in a ballroom was its own layered battle. Powdered wigs exhaled lavender, rose, orange blossom, or the sharper tang of tobacco. Perfumes clashed or harmonized in the air, creating a heady fog that masked more than the natural odors of human proximity. It also dulled the sharper, less pleasant hints that might betray a wig gone too long without proper care. For most guests, the fragrance was intoxicating. For those in the know, it was a veil behind which all manner of imperfections could hide. In the social economy of the ballroom, the wig was a currency of attention. A towering coiffure adorned with feathers, silk flowers, or even miniature ships could make a lady the centerpiece of a set. For men, the width and crispness of the curls, the precision of the powder, and the subtle gleam of the pomade spoke of wealth, taste, and the resources to maintain such standards. The competition was silent but fierce. A sagging curl, a powder stain on a collar, or the faintest rumor of unwelcome company beneath the hair could diminish a reputation faster than a misstep in the dance. Yet even as they competed for elegance, the guests shared the unspoken knowledge that the ballroom was as much a place of exchange for parasites as for pleasantries. The closeness, the constant touching of hands and brushing of shoulders, and the movement of air through the crowd created ideal conditions for the migration of lice. In a way, the ball was a kind of truce. Everyone present tacitly agreed not to acknowledge the possibility, focusing instead on the spectacle, the music, and the delicate negotiations of courtship and politics. For wigmakers and dressers, the morning after a ball was often the busiest time of the week. Wigs returned for restyling, their powder shaken loose, their curls flattened from hours of movement. Some came back with more than cosmetic wear, discreet signs of itching and irritation, tiny specks caught in the lace or hair, telltale hints of a night's unseen exchanges. These were addressed without comment, as much a part of post-ball maintenance as refreshing the scent or readying ribbons. The ballroom battleground was not without its casualties. A particularly heavy wig might slip in the heat, pins loosening as the evening wore on. Powder could cake in damp curls, leaving visible clumps. Feathers could droop in the humidity, ribbons lose their crispness. And always, there was the risk of discovery, of some unguarded moment when discomfort showed on the face, breaking the mask that the wig was meant to maintain. Yet for all its hazards, the ballroom was where the wig fulfilled its highest purpose. It was here that the artistry of the wig maker, the discipline of the wearer, and the silent resilience against the creeping realities beneath all came together. The curls shone, the powder glowed, and the scent wove itself into the music and the light. In this space, the illusion was complete, and for the span of a dance, the wearer could forget what lay beneath. But the night always ended. Candles guttered, music faded, and guests stepped back into the cooler air of the streets, their wigs still immaculate in the shadows, but already beginning to reveal the toll of the evening. Powder drifted down onto shoulders, the fragrance thinned, and the weight pressed heavier against tired necks. By the time the wig was lifted away in the privacy of a dressing room, the truth beneath, whether sweat, tangles, or the faint stir of tiny legs, was laid bare again. The ballroom was a theater in which every wig was both armor and stagecraft, every dance a test of its construction and the wearer's composure. It was a place where beauty, status, and survival intertwined so closely that they became indistinguishable, and where the grandeur of the powdered age met the persistence of life in its smallest, most determined form. By the 1760s, the powdered wig had entered a period of fevered innovation, a race to see who could push the boundaries of height, ornamentation, and sheer audacity. What had begun as a statement of refinement and authority was evolving into a spectacle so elaborate that it often teetered on the edge of absurdity. Wigs became less about practicality, if they had ever been practical, and more about creating a moving sculpture, a portable stage upon which wealth and taste could perform. In this heady climate, size and complexity were not mere vanity. They were currency in the social market. Nowhere was this more visible than in the courts of Europe's most fashion-obsessed monarchies. Paris, still the epicenter of wig culture, saw women's coiffures rise to dizzying heights. The pouf style, introduced by the hairdresser Leonard Audie for Queen Marie Antoinette, turned the head into an open canvas for storytelling. Hair was arranged into towering structures, sometimes 3 feet high, supported by wire frames, pads, and false hair. Within these frameworks, elaborate tableaus could be built. Miniature ships commemorating naval victories, pastoral scenes with tiny silk sheep and shepherdesses, even replicas of gardens or landscapes dear to the wearer. These creations were balanced with the precision of an engineer's bridge and decorated with ribbons, pearls, feathers, and flowers, real or silk. Men, too, embraced the fever of extravagance, though with slightly more restraint in silhouette. The Cadogan, hue, and bagwig styles allowed for a sleek arrangement of curls tied at the back, but their size, powder, and ornamentation grew more pronounced as competition for social visibility intensified. Court officials, military officers, and wealthy merchants all commissioned wigs with richer curls, brighter powder, and finer ribbons, each element a subtle escalation in the silent contest for attention. The escalation brought with it a surge in cost. A grand wig might require human hair purchased from multiple sources, imported horsehair for structure, wire frames, pomade, powder, and the labor of skilled artisans over many days. The price of such a piece could equal several months' wages for a skilled tradesman. For the wealthy, this was not a deterrent but an attraction, proof that they could afford both the wig and the ongoing expense of its upkeep. But extravagance had a price beyond money. The taller and heavier the wig, the more uncomfortable it became to wear. The wire supports pressed into the scalp, and the weight strained the neck. Movement was restricted. A sudden turn or bow could destabilize the structure. Sitting in a carriage or beneath a low ceiling required careful maneuvering. In some cases, women had to kneel on the floor of the carriage rather than sit upright, lest their coiffures be crushed. These towering constructions also made hygiene nearly impossible. Washing such a wig risked collapse. Even dismantling it for cleaning was a delicate and expensive process. Instead, they were maintained with layers of powder and scent, each application covering not only the visible hair, but also whatever resided within. For lice, these creations were palaces, vast networks of hair, padding, and fabric in which to roam. The warmth trapped within could be oppressive for the wearer, but for the hidden inhabitants, it was a perfect climate. Wigmakers, far from resisting the trend, leaned into it. The greater the complexity, the more valuable their skills became. They developed new methods for securing ornaments, integrating padding seamlessly into curls, and balancing structures so that they could be worn for hours without visible strain. The coiffure à la Belle Poule, with its full-rigged ship perched amid waves of powdered hair, became a symbol of this era's ingenuity and excess. It was both a fashion statement and a feat of engineering, held together by pins, pomade, and an unshakable confidence in the wearer's posture. For all its theatricality, the fever of extravagance had its own internal logic. In an age without mass media, the ballroom, theater, and promenade were the social stages where one's image was crafted and remembered. A wig that told a story or astonished the crowd was a way of securing one's place in the collective memory. To arrive with a wig so remarkable that it became the subject of gossip was to win a form of immortality, however fleeting. But the fever also carried the seeds of its own decline. As styles reached ever greater extremes, satirists and caricaturists began to mock them mercilessly. Prints in Paris and London depicted women trapped in doorways by their coiffures, men knocked over by the wake of a lady's poof, or wigs so infested that tiny figures could be seen fleeing the curls. These images delighted the public and hinted at a growing skepticism toward the culture of excess. Practical difficulties also began to weigh heavily. The cost of maintenance, the risk of structural failure in rain or wind, the constant battle with hidden pests, all were tolerated in the name of fashion, but only just. For some, the burden of wearing such a wig was worth the social reward. For others, it became a quiet source of resentment, a price paid too often for too little return. Still, in the fever years, restraint was the exception. Those who wished to stand out had little choice but to play the game, and the game demanded escalation. Even those who claimed to disdain the tallest styles found themselves investing in subtler forms of competition: finer powder, rarer ornaments, more perfect symmetry in the curls. The fever was not simply about size. It was about the relentless drive to outdo one's peers, whether in height, ornament, or refinement. As the century's political and economic climate began to shift, the fever of extravagance would meet its reckoning. But in its heyday, it was a dazzling, absurd, and utterly human expression of the 18th century's appetite for display. Beneath the powder and perfume, beneath the jewels and feathers, the same realities persisted: the weight, the discomfort, the tiny creatures moving unseen. And yet, night after night, the wearers walked into ballrooms and salons with heads held high, confident that their magnificent constructions would outshine all others. The fever would burn until it could burn no more, its brilliance matched only by its fragility. And when it broke, it would leave behind not only a new era of fashion but the memory of a time when hair, whether one's own or borrowed, was the stage upon which an entire society performed its dreams, ambitions, and vanities. In the 18th century, the politics of scent could be as delicate and as decisive as any treaty signed in a palace chamber. In an era before modern sanitation, fragrance was not a frivolous addition to one's toilette. It was a statement, a shield, and, at times, a weapon. Nowhere was this more evident than in the world of powdered wigs, where the air around one's head was as carefully curated as the curls themselves. The way a wig smelled could enhance its beauty, camouflage its flaws, and send subtle messages to allies and rivals alike. The base ingredient for most wig powders was a simple starch, ground fine enough to cling invisibly to each strand of hair. By itself, starch had little scent, faintly dusty, neutral, even comforting, but the fashion of the day demanded more. Perfumers and wig makers worked together to infuse powders with fragrance, turning every application into a sensory performance. Orris root gave a soft, violet note that lasted for days. Lavender offered a crisp, herbal cleanliness. Bergamot and lemon provided bright, fleeting top notes that faded gracefully into the heart of the scent. Rosewater, distilled from petals, lent an unmistakable floral elegance, though it could sour if improperly stored. Application was a ritual steeped in precision. In the privacy of a dressing room, a valet or hairdresser would dip a puff into the scented powder, shake off the excess, and pat it over the wig in measured strokes. The air would bloom with fragrance, settling over the wearer like a perfumed veil. The choice of scent was as deliberate as the choice of wig style. A statesman might favor the steady reassurance of lavender and rosemary, a courtier the flirtation of orange blossom and musk, a lady of fashion the romantic luxury of rose and ambergris. But the perfume's purpose extended beyond delight. It was a mask, concealing the odors that inevitably gathered in a wig worn for hours in crowded rooms or under the heat of summer. Pomade, the animal fat base used to set curls, had a distinctive, slightly rancid smell if left too long without renewal. Sweat from the scalp could mingle with powder, creating a faint mustiness. And in wigs left uncleaned for weeks, there might be subtler, more troubling undertones: the sour trace of infestation, the sharp tang of herbal fumigants used to fight it. A well-chosen scent could smother all of this. ensuring that no guest leaning in to exchange a greeting would suspect what lay beneath. In the social theaters of the century, ballrooms, salons, theaters, court audiences, scent functioned as a form of invisible diplomacy. A fragrance that was too strong could overwhelm the delicate blend of perfumes worn by others, marking the wearer as gauche or inconsiderate, too faint, and one wrist seeming careless or impoverished, unable to afford the regular renewal of powder and pomade. The balance was a subtle art, and those who mastered it could control impressions as surely as they controlled conversation. Yet scent could also be a weapon. In the whispered rivalries of court, it was possible to wound without a single word by letting one's nose wrinkle at the wrong moment, or by remarking, within earshot, on an unfamiliar or unfortunate fragrance. A rival's heavily perfumed wig might be interpreted as desperation, an attempt to cover neglect or illness. Conversely, a wig with too little scent could invite speculation about frugality or poor grooming. These judgments were often unfounded, but in an environment where perception was everything, they could be devastating. Perfume was also used tactically in matters of attraction. A man might select a scent known to please a particular woman, ensuring that when they danced, the fragrance lingered between them. A woman might wear a blend that contrasted with the floral tones common at court, making her presence distinct and memorable. In the dim light of theaters and salons, scent was often the first impression and the last trace. The politics of the nose extended beyond the individual. Entire nations developed reputations for their preferred scents. The French for their complex blends rich in floral and musky notes, the English for cleaner, more herbal compositions, the Italians for citrus and spice. To arrive in a foreign court scented according to local custom was a gesture of respect. To arrive scented otherwise could be taken as a statement of independence or defiance. Wigmakers, ever attuned to the needs of their clients, kept pace with these shifting olfactory fashions. They stocked shelves of powders in varying scents and strengths, often blending custom orders for particular patrons. Some even developed signature fragrances, so that a wig leaving their shop carried an identifiable aura. This could be a mark of pride, or a source of scandal if the scent became associated with poor upkeep or infestation. There were limits, however, to what scent could achieve. In the stifling heat of a crowded assembly, even the finest perfume could be overpowered by the mix of human bodies, candle smoke, and the tang of wine and food. A wig that had been pushed past its point of freshness might betray itself no matter how much powder was applied. And when the scent faded, it often revealed not only the physical realities beneath but the fact that they had been deliberately masked. Still, for much of the century, the politics of the nose remained central to the wig's role in society. The choice of fragrance, the skill of its application, and the discipline of its renewal were as much markers of status as the cut of one's coat or the sparkle of one's jewels. A head well powdered and perfumed could enter any room with confidence, secure in the knowledge that it would be remembered for beauty rather than betrayed by reality. In this way, scent was not merely an accessory to the wig, but an inseparable part of its power. It softened the edges of discomfort, disguised the signs of wear, and turned the space around the wearer into a sphere of influence invisible to the eye but unmistakable to the senses. And like the wig itself, it was both a triumph of artifice and a reminder of what artifice is meant to hide. In public, the powdered wig was a flawless crown, immaculate, fragrant, and perfectly balanced. But in the privacy of bedchambers, dressing rooms, and servants' quarters, the truth was far less glamorous. Maintaining such a piece of fashion was an ongoing campaign, and the rituals of wig care, performed daily or weekly depending on the owner's resources and habits, were acts of quiet labor hidden from the gaze of polite society. Here, behind closed doors, the illusion was dismantled, examined, and painstakingly rebuilt. The process often began at the end of a long day or night. After hours in ballrooms, court chambers, or crowded salons, the wig was removed with deliberate care, lest pins snag or padding shift. A valet or lady's maid would lift it from the wearer's head, sometimes revealing the flattened, sweat-damp hair beneath, marked by the weight of wire and curls. The sensation of relief, the sudden lightness on the neck, was matched only by the discomfort of seeing the wig in its raw, post-performance state. Powder dulled, curls loosened, scent faded, and sometimes the faint telltale signs of life within. The first step in private maintenance was airing. Wigs were placed on wooden stands or padded forms, designed to preserve their shape, and set in a place with good ventilation but away from harsh sunlight, which could fade the powder or weaken the hair. In summer, windows might be opened to allow a breeze to pass through. In winter, the wig might rest near a low fire, the heat helping to dry any dampness from perspiration or humidity. The goal was to let the piece breathe, releasing the stale air trapped within. Once aired, the wig was examined. Servants trained in the art of wig care knew where to look for trouble. Along the lace foundation where it met the scalp, in the tight inner curls where powder clumped, and deep in the structure where padding and hair created hidden pockets. A fine-toothed comb could loosen powder residue, but combing was a delicate matter. Too much and the curls would collapse, too little and the buildup would remain, dulling the wig's sheen. Infestation was a risk always hovering over these inspections. If movement was detected, the wig underwent a quiet, urgent treatment. For minor cases, a dusting of tobacco powder or finely crushed herbs might suffice. More serious infestations demanded fumigation. The wig placed in a sealed box or cabinet with burning rosemary, wormwood, or in extreme cases, sulfur. The smoke would curl through the hair, suffocating pests, though it left a scent that had to be masked with fresh powder before the wig could be worn again. Pomade application was another key part of the private ritual. Made from animal fat, usually bear or mutton tallow, and perfumed with oils, pomade gave curls their structure and sheen. Servants warmed it slightly before use, making it pliable enough to work into the hair without breaking delicate strands. Applied sparingly, it tamed flyaways and held the shape between major stylings. Applied too heavily, it could weigh the wig down and trap dust. In wealthier households, different pomades were kept for different purposes. A lighter blend for daily wear, a richer, more heavily scented one for grand occasions. Powdering, too, could be part of the nightly care, though more often it was reserved for mornings. Some households kept small, refreshing puffs at hand, allowing a quick dusting after a wig had been cleaned or aired. For wigs stored overnight, a linen or silk cover, sometimes lined with cedar shavings or lavender, was drawn over the stand to protect against dust and deter pests. These covers, like the wigs themselves, required regular cleaning, lest they become havens for the very creatures they were meant to keep away. In more modest homes, the rituals were condensed. A single wig might serve for both daily wear and special occasions, meaning it endured greater wear and longer intervals between cleanings. Here, the owner might perform much of the maintenance themselves, standing before a mirror with a simple comb and a pouch of powder, doing their best to revive the curls and scent. Without the luxury of multiple wigs to rotate, each cleaning was a gamble. Dismantling and washing the piece risked damaging it, but leaving it uncleaned risked discomfort and social embarrassment. Storage was as important as cleaning. In cities, where space was limited, wigs might be kept in drawers or boxes, often with sachets of herbs or dried citrus peels. In country houses, they could rest in larger cabinets, sometimes alongside hats and other headwear. The wealthiest patrons commissioned custom-made wig cases for travel, lined with silk and fitted with compartments for scratching sticks, combs, and small containers of powder and pomade. A well-designed case could keep a wig in near-perfect condition on the road, though its contents still required tending upon arrival. Perhaps the most revealing part of the private ritual was the interaction between owner and servant. In these moments, the wig was stripped of its grandeur, reduced to a piece of craftsmanship in need of repair. The servant's skill determined how long the illusion could be maintained, and their discretion ensured that no hint of imperfection reached the outside world. A trusted valet or maid might know more about the true state of a patron's wigs and scalp than the patron's own spouse. There was, too, a psychological dimension to these private acts. For the wearer, the nightly removal and inspection of the wig could be a reminder of the gulf between public presentation and private reality. The curls and powder that commanded attention at a ball or in a courtroom were, at day's end, simply hair and fabric, vulnerable to dust, decay, and the smallest of intruders. The rituals of care were acts of restoration not only for the wig, but for the identity it represented. In this way, behind closed doors, the grand illusions of the powdered age were maintained stitch by stitch, curl by curl, puff by puff. The public saw only the finished crown, radiant under candlelight, fragrant and flawless. They never saw the quiet labor that sustained it, the comb drawn through a clump of powder, the gentle twist of a curl restored to place, the faint tendril of rosemary smoke curling from a fumigation box. It was in these moments, hidden from the gaze of society, that the wig's true survival was secured. In the glittering world of the 18th century, etiquette was as rigid as the wire frames supporting the era's most elaborate wigs. Every gesture was observed, every movement interpreted. A misplaced glance could bruise a reputation. A poorly timed word could undo a season's worth of careful social maneuvering. In this finely tuned theater of manners, the human body, with its unavoidable itches, twinges, and small rebellions, was a liability to be managed with the utmost discretion. And no bodily betrayal was more dangerous to one's composure than the sudden, burning itch beneath a powdered wig. The etiquette manuals of the time, while silent on the subject of lice, were explicit about comportment in public. Hands were to remain still unless engaged in an intentional gesture. Scratching, fidgeting, or adjusting one's clothing without necessity were signs of poor breeding. The head and face, in particular, were to remain poised. A calm stage for the performance of conversation, dance, or political negotiation. But wigs, with their dense curls, animal fat pomades, and weeks-long wear, created an environment where discomfort was not a possibility, but an inevitability. Those of means prepared for this reality. The scratching stick, slender, discreet, often carved from ivory or tipped with silver, was the sanctioned tool for addressing an itch without betraying the struggle. Carried in a pocket or hidden in a sleeve, it could be slipped under the wig with practiced ease, delivering a moment's relief while maintaining the posture of elegance. A true master of the art could deploy it mid-conversation, eyes steady, voice unbroken, as if the motion were no more than a casual adjustment of a ribbon. But etiquette demanded more than mechanical skill. It required an understanding of timing and setting. In the ballroom, a scratching stick might be used during the turn of a dance, when the partner's gaze was elsewhere. In the theater, a moment of darkness between acts offered a brief reprieve. At court, the art was to wait for a distraction, a ripple of laughter, a movement of the crowd, before making the smallest possible motion. For those without a scratching stick, the stakes were higher. Fingers could be employed, but only with extreme subtlety, the hand moving to the temple as if in thought, the fingertips pressing just long enough to still the sensation. To scratch openly, to let the hand wander visibly beneath the curls, was unthinkable. It was not merely a breach of decorum, but an invitation for whispered speculation, that one's wig was poorly kept, that one's valet was careless, that one was, perhaps, afflicted with the indignity of pests. Fragrance played its own role in the etiquette of discomfort. A fresh application of powder could sometimes soothe irritation, the fine starch absorbing moisture and the scent masking any unpleasantness. A well-trained servant attending a hostess might notice the signs, a slight tilt of the head, a tightening of the jaw, and bring a powder puff under the pretext of refreshing the style. This allowed the wearer to find relief under the guise of maintaining appearance. The social danger of visible discomfort was magnified by the nature of 18th century gatherings. Rooms were crowded, the air thick with scent, and personal space scarce. A misplaced movement might brush against another's wig, transferring not only powder but the suspicion of something unwelcome. The fear of such contact was rarely spoken aloud, but it hung in the air as palpably as perfume. To maintain composure under these circumstances was as much a mark of breeding as one's attire or speech. Etiquette also extended to the handling of others' discomfort. To notice another guest using a scratching stick was to pretend one had seen nothing. To acknowledge it, even with a glance, would be a breach of the unspoken pact that allowed polite society to function. The same applied to scent. If one detected an odor beneath the powder, etiquette demanded silence. Publicly, the wig was always perfect. Privately, servants and wig-makers might whisper the truth, but among peers it was never named. This unspoken agreement was not merely kindness, it was self-preservation. Today's observer could be tomorrow's sufferer. In the close social circles of court and city, reputations could shift with alarming speed, and no one was immune to the realities of wig-wearing. To shame another for discomfort was to invite the same weapon to be turned against oneself at the next opportunity. Of course, etiquette was not always obeyed. Satirists and caricaturists found rich material in the public's unease around wigs. Prints circulated showing nobles scratching furiously in private corners, or entire assemblies of powdered heads alive with exaggerated vermin. These images, while humorous, carried a sting. They reminded viewers that the grand facade of polite society was, at its edges, vulnerable to the same small indignities as any village gathering. In the end, the itch of etiquette was less about the sensation itself and more about the discipline it required. To wear a wig was to carry a burden of performance, a constant awareness of how one appeared, moved, and even smelled. The itch was the body's rebellion against that performance, a demand for attention that had to be met without disrupting the illusion. Those who mastered this balance could glide through a room as if untouched by human frailty, their powdered crowns steady and untarnished. Those who failed risked more than a moment's embarrassment. They risked their place in the intricate web of social standing that defined the age. In this way, the etiquette surrounding wigs was not merely a set of rules but a kind of training, a discipline of mind over body, of image over truth. It was a constant reminder that in the 18th century, the most delicate battles were often fought not in the courts or on the ballroom floor, but in the quiet struggle between an itch and the will to keep one's hand still. To the casual observer, the powdered wig was an unambiguous emblem of elegance, a gleaming crown of curls that announced wealth, refinement, and authority. But for those who wore them year after year, the truth was more complicated. Beauty in the 18th century came at a price, and in the case of wigs, that price was paid not only in coins but in comfort, health, and the fragile economy of reputation. The most obvious cost was financial. A well-made wig from a respected wig maker could rival the cost of fine furniture or a month's rent on a city townhouse. The finest human hair was sourced from rural sellers, often young women in need of cash, and commanded a premium if it was long, well-kept, and naturally light in color. Coarser horsehair, used for structure, was cheaper but still costly when imported in bulk. Add to this the expense of wire frames, lace foundations, pomades, powders, and the skilled labor of journeyman knotters, curlers, and dressers, and even a modest wig could be a serious investment. But the purchase price was only the beginning. Wigs demanded constant maintenance, regular powdering, periodic restyling, replacement of worn curls, and the application of fresh pomade to keep hair supple. Wealthier owners rotated several wigs, allowing each to rest between wearings and extending its life. But this meant multiplying costs. For those of more modest means, the choice was starker: spend heavily on upkeep or watch one's wig deteriorate into a limp, faded liability. In either case, the expense was ongoing, an invisible tax levied by fashion. Physical discomfort was another part of the price. The weight of a large wig could strain the neck and shoulders, especially in women's towering coiffures supported by wire and padding. Heat built up quickly beneath the dense layers of hair, pomade, and powder, especially in crowded rooms or during summer months. Perspiration not only caused discomfort but could damage the wig's structure, dissolving pomade or matting curls. Prolonged wear could also irritate the scalp, leading to redness, sores, or even hair loss, an irony not lost on those who relied on wigs to mask thinning hair in the first place. The most persistent physical cost came from infestation. Lice thrived in the warm, sheltered environment of wigs, and even with fumigation, powders, and scented deterrents, complete eradication was rare. Scratching could break the skin, leading to secondary infections in an era before antibiotics. The psychological toll of constant low-level irritation, coupled with the effort required to conceal it, was real, though rarely acknowledged. It was a discomfort born in silence, masked by powder, perfume, and the discipline of etiquette. There was also the social cost of failure. In a culture where appearance was a form of currency, a poorly maintained wig could be disastrous. Powder clumping in damp curls, a sagging structure, or a faint, sour odor could undermine one's standing as quickly as a public faux pas. Rumors spread fast in the tight social circles of court, salon, and professional guild. To be whispered about as ill-kept, or, worse, unclean, could close doors to advancement, marriage prospects, and valuable alliances. Maintaining the illusion of perfection was not simply a matter of vanity. It was a matter of survival in the competitive economy of status. For women at court, the cost of beauty in wigs was bound up with the broader demands of fashion. A towering coiffure might take hours to construct, requiring a hairdresser's full attention and the patience to sit motionless as curls were pinned, powdered, and adorned. Once built, it was intended to last for days, even a week, which meant sleeping upright or on special supports to preserve its shape. This preserved the style but compounded the discomfort as dirt, oil, and pests accumulated. The endurance required was a point of pride, but also a reminder of the lengths to which one had to go simply to remain in the game. Men, though spared the extreme heights of women's wigs, faced their own burdens. In professions like law or politics, the wig was not optional but part of the uniform. A barrister who appeared in court without his wig risked being seen as disrespectful to the institution. A politician who neglected the latest style risked appearing out of touch. The pressure to maintain a fresh, fashionable wig was constant, and the unspoken competition among peers could drive costs and discomfort ever higher. Travel posed additional challenges and expenses. Wigs had to be transported in protective cases, guarded against crushing or exposure to damp. Servants trained in wig care often accompanied their masters, adding to travel costs. Even so, changes in climate or the rigors of the road could leave a wig limp, dusty, or in need of emergency repairs upon arrival. In such cases, finding a skilled local wig maker was as critical as finding suitable lodging. And then there was the hidden cost of dependency. For many, the wig became not just a fashion statement, but a mask without which they felt incomplete, even exposed. The thought of appearing in public without it, with natural hair uncovered, unpowdered, and unadorned, was unthinkable. This reliance meant that the wig's upkeep was non-negotiable, no matter the strain it placed on purse or body. The wig was both a symbol of status and a tether to the constant demands of maintaining that status. For all these costs, few were willing to abandon the wig entirely. The social rewards, the access to certain circles, the respect afforded by the visual language of refinement, the simple pleasure of being seen at one's best, outweighed the discomforts for most wearers. The wig was an investment in identity, a piece of personal theater whose upkeep was as essential as the script in a play. Yet the hidden costs accumulated. Over years, they wore down even the most devoted adherents to fashion. Neck pain lingered, scalp irritation became chronic, fortunes dwindled in the pursuit of ever more elaborate styles. By the last decades of the century, as political and social upheaval began to shake the foundations of the old order, the appetite for such burdens began to wane. New fashions emerged, simpler and less encumbered, promising relief from the literal and figurative weight of the powdered crown. In retrospect, the powdered wig was both a marvel and a cautionary tale. It showed how far people would go, financially, physically, socially, to inhabit an ideal, and how that ideal, once accepted, could demand more than its share of the wearer's life. Beauty was never free, and in the 18th century, it could be as costly as any vice. By the closing decades of the 18th century, the powdered wig, once the towering emblem of refinement and power, was beginning to lose its hold on Europe's imagination. For more than a century, it had been an unshakable pillar of elite identity, its curls and powder as much a part of the ruling class as titles and estates. But fashion, like empires, does not last forever. Political unrest, economic pressures, and shifting attitudes toward health and simplicity began to conspire against the powdered age, stripping the wig first of its necessity, then of its desirability. The first cracks appeared in the realm of politics. In France, the revolution that erupted in 1789 was not merely a political upheaval, it was a cultural one. The elaborate wigs of the aristocracy became visual shorthand for the decadence and detachment of the old regime. Pamphlets and political cartoons mocked nobles with heads weighed down by absurd coiffures, suggesting that such ornament was a sign of moral decay. To be seen in a towering poof or a full-bottomed perruque in revolutionary Paris was to invite ridicule, or worse. Many of the wealthy quietly abandoned their most ostentatious wigs, adopting simpler styles or going bareheaded in public as a gesture of solidarity with the new order, or at least as a measure of self-preservation. Across the Channel, England was less politically volatile, but change was still in the air. The imposition of the hair powder tax in 1795, a response to the nation's mounting war expenses, accelerated the decline. The levy was designed to target the wealthy, charging them for the privilege of maintaining powdered coiffures. The result was both practical and symbolic. Many men abandoned powder entirely, choosing to wear their natural hair cropped short in the new Brutus style, inspired by classical antiquity and the political virtues it was thought to represent. Women's styles also shifted toward softer, looser arrangements that emphasized natural texture rather than powdered uniformity. Economic realities played a decisive role. Maintaining wigs had always been costly, but as the century closed, the financial burden became harder to justify. War disrupted trade in hair, perfumes, and fine powders, driving up prices. Skilled wig makers, many of whom had served the aristocracy, found their clientele shrinking. Some adapted by offering haircuts and natural hair care, while others closed their shops entirely. Without the constant reinforcement of availability and affordability, the powdered wig's presence in daily life began to falter. Health and hygiene, too, began to reshape attitudes. Enlightenment-era interest in science and medicine encouraged more frequent washing of the body and hair. Physicians who once tolerated wigs as a necessary evil now warned that their heat and weight could encourage skin ailments or harbor pests. Publications on domestic health promoted natural hair as cleaner and more practical, particularly for the rising middle class eager to distinguish itself from the perceived excesses of the nobility. The change was also aesthetic. The exaggerated forms of the mid-century, with their towering heights and elaborate decorations, came to be seen as outdated, even absurd, in an age that increasingly valued classical simplicity. The neoclassical movement in art and architecture found a parallel in hair. Smooth, Grecian-inspired arrangements replaced the powdered mass of curls, echoing ancient statuary and Roman busts. This new ideal emphasized the shape of the head and face rather than burying them beneath artificial volume. In military and professional contexts, practicality asserted itself. Soldiers, sailors, and civil servants, long required to wear wigs in certain settings, began to transition to shorter, natural haircuts that were easier to maintain in the field or office. Even in the British legal profession, where wigs would linger as ceremonial attire, there was a gradual shift toward more restrained styles. The wig remained a symbol of institutional continuity, but outside formal occasions, many professionals left it behind. By the early 19th century, the powdered wig had been reduced to a relic of ceremony and tradition. Its presence persisted in the courtrooms of England, the pulpits of certain churches, and the rare formal portrait, but in the daily life of Europe's elites, it was largely gone. The reasons were as much psychological as practical. The wig had been too closely associated with a social order that was fading, and its reappearance would have carried the weight of nostalgia, even defiance. For those who had lived through its heyday, the disappearance of the wig was bittersweet. It marked the end of a particular kind of performance, a time when the head was a stage for wealth, politics, and ingenuity. For wig makers, it meant the loss of a craft honed over decades, replaced by simpler trades. And for the former wearers, it meant both liberation from the discomforts of the powdered age and the quiet acknowledgement that something grand, if also flawed, had passed from the world. Yet the wig's legacy endured. It lived on in portraiture, in satirical prints, and in the ceremonial dress of certain professions. More subtly, it left behind the idea that hair could be more than a natural feature, that it could be a constructed identity, a tool of influence, a language of status. Even stripped of powder and curls, that lesson would continue to shape fashion for centuries to come. In the end, the decline of the powdered age was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling. The forces of politics, economy, health, and taste conspired quietly, each pulling a thread until the structure could no longer hold. When it finally fell away, the world beneath looked different. Lighter, perhaps cleaner, but also less ornate, less theatrical. The powdered wig had been a crown of artifice, worn proudly for over 100 years. Its departure left behind not just bare heads, but a space in the culture where grandeur and discomfort had once lived side by side. When the powdered wig vanished from everyday life in the early 19th century, it did not disappear entirely. In courtrooms, pulpits, and a handful of stubborn salons, a small group of wearers refused to part with the emblem that had crowned them through their most confident years. These were the last powdered heads, living relics of a bygone age, both admired for their fidelity to tradition and quietly pitted for their refusal to step into the new world. Some of these holdouts belonged to professions where the wig was still required. In England, the legal system preserved the full-bottomed wig for judges and the shorter bob wig for barristers. Here, powder was less a matter of fashion than of uniform, a symbol of continuity in a profession that prided itself on resisting change. Inside the courtroom, the wig still conferred authority, lending even the youngest barrister an air of seasoned gravitas. But outside, walking home through London's streets, the same wig could draw curious stares from children and smirks from apprentices who had never known the powdered age in its prime. Others held on to their wigs out of personal conviction. Elderly aristocrats, their portraits painted decades earlier in clouds of powder, could not imagine themselves without that familiar frame to their features. For them, abandoning the wig would have felt like abandoning their identity. In certain drawing rooms and country estates, one could still find an old marquis or dowager countess presiding over the table beneath a carefully powdered crown, the scent of orris root mingling with the aroma of roast and claret. Guests might note that the style was out of step with the times, but in such surroundings, traditions still carried weight. In some cases, the last powdered heads were driven by nostalgia. For those who had come of age in the ballroom culture of the mid-18th century, the wig was bound up with memories of youth, of dances under candlelight, whispered conversations behind fans, the rustle of silk and the glitter of chandeliers. Powder was not just starch and scent, it was the perfume of remembered glory. Even as fashions shifted to cropped hair and natural curls, these veterans of another era kept their wigs close, like mementos of a theater whose curtain had long since fallen. The persistence of wigs in these pockets of society had unintended consequences. In an age that now associated powdered coiffures with the ancien regime, the sight of one could spark assumptions, sometimes flattering, sometimes not. Admirers saw refinement, discipline, and a refusal to be swept along by passing trends. Critics saw obstinacy, vanity, or the clinging of privilege to its old symbols. In revolutionary France, the wrong wig could still be dangerous. In post-revolutionary England, it could make one a caricature in the popular press. Practical challenges also plagued the last powdered heads. The infrastructure that had once supported the wig trade was vanishing. Many of the great wig makers had retired or shifted to other trades, and those who remained catered almost exclusively to ceremonial needs. Quality hair was harder to source, as rural sellers now sold less to the wig trade and more to the growing market for hair extensions and natural hairpieces. The powders, pomades, and perfumes once available in abundance were now produced in smaller quantities, often at higher cost. Maintenance became a personal burden. Without the regular services of professional wig dressers, some wearers learned to tend their wigs themselves or relied on long-serving servants who remembered the old techniques. Powder rooms fell silent. Fumigation cabinets gathered dust. The rituals that had once been part of a bustling, public fashion industry were now solitary acts, performed in the privacy of homes that were themselves beginning to feel like monuments to another time. The social meaning of wigs, too, had shifted. In the 18th century, a powdered wig could bridge the gap between public persona and private self. It was a mask everyone understood. By the early 19th century, the wig had become a kind of confession, a public admission that one's sense of self was rooted in a world that no longer existed. For younger generations, it was a curiosity, an object to be remarked upon, sometimes with respect, more often with amusement. And yet, for the last powdered heads, there was dignity in persistence. They saw themselves not as anachronisms, but as custodians of a tradition worth preserving. In courtrooms, The wig remained a reminder that justice was not a passing fashion. In the rarefied spaces of old estates, it was a signal that lineage and memory still mattered. Even in city streets, the sight of a powdered crown could provoke a double take, and in that moment, the wearer reclaimed a fragment of the attention that wigs had once commanded everywhere. By mid-century, even these holdouts were dwindling. Age claimed the last of the aristocrats who had worn wigs in their youth. Professional reforms pared down the occasions when they were required. In some places, the ceremonial wig survived, as in British courts to this day, but the powder, once inseparable from the wig's image, gradually fell away. What remained was a faint echo of the powdered age, stripped of its former excess but still carrying the shape of its authority. For those who had lived entirely within the reign of the wig, the final years of its decline could feel like watching a language disappear. Its curls, powder, and scent had been a code understood by everyone in their world, and now that code was unreadable to most. The wig's departure was not mourned widely, but for the last powdered heads, it was a private bereavement, the quiet loss of a way of presenting oneself that had, for better or worse, given their lives a frame. And so they went on, a dwindling handful, carrying the powdered crown into drawing rooms, courts, and salons that no longer demanded it, but still remembered, dimly, when it had been the mark of elegance itself. In their persistence, they kept alive the last embers of an age when the head was not simply hair and scalp, but a stage upon which beauty, power, and artifice played their most intricate games. The story of the 18th century powdered wig is, on the surface, a chronicle of fashion, its rise in the courts of kings, its evolution into towering monuments of artifice, its slow retreat into the fringes of tradition. But beneath the powder, the curls, and the perfume lies a deeper truth, one that speaks less about hair and more about the human condition. The wig was never just a garment for the head. It was a mask, a stage, a declaration. For more than a century, to put one on was to step into a role: judge, statesman, courtier, debutante. It transformed the wearer into a participant in a shared illusion, where status could be measured in inches of height, ounces of powder, or the complexity of a curl. It was an emblem of refinement, yet also of vulnerability, for to maintain the illusion required constant vigilance, expense, and the quiet endurance of discomfort. It was also a reminder that beauty and power often come with hidden costs. The powdered crown that dazzled under candlelight might hide sweat, tangles, or the restless movement of tiny legs. The fragrance that charmed across a dance floor might be chosen not purely for allure, but to disguise what could not be spoken aloud. The wig was a public triumph that, in private, required a daily reckoning with its own fragility. In this way, the powdered wig's history mirrors the rhythms of so much human ambition. We build structures, of hair, of wealth, of reputation, knowing they must be maintained at all costs if they are to endure. We craft images of ourselves that the world can admire, even as we bear in silence the discomforts they bring. And when the world changes, as it always does, we face the choice of whether to adapt or to hold on, knowing that to keep the crown is also to keep the weight it carries. Its decline was inevitable, for all fashions pass. But the powdered wig's fall was not simply the end of an aesthetic. It marked a turning in European life toward new ideals, the natural over the artificial, the simple over the ornate, the personal over the ceremonial. It was a shift in the balance between display and authenticity, though not the end of the dance between them. For in every era, new symbols arise to replace the old, and each will have its own powder, its own perfume, its own hidden costs. Today, the wig survives in fragments, on the heads of British barristers, in historical reenactments, in portraits that still gaze down from museum walls. But its true legacy is less tangible. It is in the enduring human impulse to dress the self not only for warmth or modesty, but to project an idea of status, authority, beauty, belonging. It is in the knowledge that artifice, however elaborate, is never complete. There is always something beneath the powder, unseen but shaping the experience of those who wear it. In the end, the powdered wig was both an achievement and a caution. It showed how imagination and craftsmanship could turn the human head into a work of art, and how art, in turn, could become a burden. It was a crown anyone could commission, but few could bear lightly. And like all crowns, it was a reminder that what glitters most brightly in public view often requires, in private, the most careful maintenance and the greatest willingness to endure what lies unseen.